Pat Biilmann, CEO, founder of Netlify. Welcome to the Insight Jam.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, so let's start right from the beginning. What was the opportunity you were trying to solve when you first started Netlify?
It almost starts a while before Netlify, right? Like I was CTO of a company in Spain that had a lot of different projects, but our main moneymaker was building websites for small to medium businesses at a very large scale. So like at our peak, we were building more than 100 websites a week to get just sense of sort of the scale, right? Like, and as CTO, I ran the teams that built the whole platform that the designers would do design with, the end users we use for content management, and that powered every single website all the way from the first brief into production hosting. And then sort of pretty organically, I started a startup in Spain together with the founders of that company saying, okay, we just built 3 different iterations of this platform in-house. Let's build a multi-tenant cloud-hosted CMS that other agencies and other professionals can use to get the same benefits when they're building for their clients. And came to the Bay Area working on that. When I started building the belief that we were sort of in front of a more fundamental shift in the architecture of the web. Like at that time, if you thought about an e-commerce or a corporate site or anything like it, you would typically, they would be like one monolithic application based on like an end-to-end system that would both do the UI and the business logic and content management and all of that. And you would have different ones of those depending on like if you were building a restaurant booking site, you would probably have a monolithic system pretty specific to that. If you're building e-commerce, you wouldn't dream of taking your e-commerce platform and also building corporate sites with that, and so on and so on, right? Like, and I saw this API application starting to happen of those backend pieces. I sort of saw the very first headless CMSs come around that turned sort of a lot of the content concern into an API, and started believing that like the right way of architecturing all of these would be decoupling the actual web experience layer from all the underlying backend business logic and being able to work on that in isolation, and then having these different concerns turn into different APIs and services. And that was where I saw that like right at the time I started Netlify, the first couple of headless CMSs were maybe coming around, but no one were really thinking about it. If that's the way of the future, what are we going to do with the head, right? Like, how are we going to build these web experiences? And that was the original starting point for this whole journey, saying like, what's the best possible, like what changes when the web UI is no longer just like sitting sort of inside some backend application? What does that make possible? And what would the right end-to-end platform for really making it fast for developers to build amazing web experiences look like?
Well, so I think it's funny. We think of that time as ancient history. It's like 10 years ago. So I get what the how it kind of evolved and the opportunity presented itself, but the opportunity is different now.
Yeah.
What's the opportunity today?
I mean, I think it's still the same vein of opportunity, right? Like, and you might have heard us in the early day, I coined this term Jamstack, and we had to really evangelize this fundamental idea of decoupling the web UI from the backend, and this idea of using pure front-end frameworks, right? Like before that, there wasn't really such a thing, right? Like, over time now we might be talking a bit more about composable architectures and so on, because we've really gone from like greenfield projects and companies like spinning up a new thing to also starting to figure out, okay, what do all the really big companies that have like lots of existing setups and infrastructure, what kind of tooling do we need to give them to help them like embrace this like de facto way of building for the web, right? If you could choose today, you would probably just instinctively go build with like a modern decoupled approach, right? Like, but if you are sitting in a bunch of big monoliths, that's really hard, right? Like, so I think part of our opportunity is in actually like helping that whole more mature part of the market modernize. And then there's opportunities on the other side of like what's next for the web, right? Like what's the next thing for the web?
So the so the opportunity, some of the opportunity anyway, is helping legacy builders and legacy systems kind of come to the more modern
Yeah.
Jamstack approach.
Yeah, definitely, right? Like, and we've invested a lot in parts of our products, like Netlify Connect, which is kind of like this bridge layer that can connect to things like Salesforce Commerce Cloud, right? Like, and give you a modern GraphQL API that your front end team can just build on top of without having to worry about the underlying or like any of these systems, right? Like whether it's your old Drupal install or Adobe Experience Manager or an in-house like monolith. We try to build those systems that also allow these larger companies to take advantage of this approach without having to rewrite everything from scratch, right? Like taking sort of a gradual approach.
Are you tuning your marketing and tuning your sales to approach that target market, which is it strikes me as a different target than what you might have started looking at early on?
It is for sure, and I would say we have sort of tuned our marketing a bit more in that direction, and you will see things like us being included in Gartner quadrants and so on as something that's obviously like different than
old
the
school.
early days. In the same at the same time, right now, I'm in a certain process of like kind of bringing back our original developer first messaging, because I think what I realized is that like even if we sell into those companies, it's still like a technical sale and a technical buyer, right? Like, and it's more important that once we come in front of them and talk to them, we actually have like a mature and valuable offering that can really like give return of investment than that we talk that language everywhere, right? Like, so there's definitely, I think every bottom up developer tool experience some of this, right? Like we've built this like pretty big bottom up motion where we've now onboarded more than 5 million developers to our platform, right? Like, and that brings us into essentially every kind of company size, vertical, industry, use case. And then we need to couple that with a more focused enterprise motion with messaging that doesn't necessarily need to be all over everything we do, but that does really explain well the very real value we can bring when we are talking to these kind of like often really big companies that has an important e-commerce component or retail component that's driven by online engagement and so on, and where our product can potentially really help them ship faster and increase conversions upwards.
And are you seeing those buys? So one of my theories that I share with almost everybody is the adoption of cloud. The cloud paradigm initially was resisted by kind of a legacy old guard that didn't believe in it. They believed in more control, and the idea of a cloud approach just didn't jive with the way they were brought through their IT career. And once those folks started to kind of cycle out, you saw the cloud really kind of kick in as the decision makers got maybe a little more comfortable and just didn't know anything different because they'd been raised on cloud apps. Is that what you're seeing now? Do you consider the people that you're working with at some of these larger companies and some of these larger opportunities maybe a different decision maker than you might have seen 10 years ago?
Yeah, there'll be a bit of a mixture, right? Like, because I think part of our message has also been that if you take this approach where you essentially decouple the web UI completely from the underlying backend infrastructure, right? Like you can kind of take independent decisions on those two layers, right? Like, and traditionally, even if you were fully bought in on-prem, if you were a big enough company, you would probably also like put every public facing asset that you could on a global CDN, right? Like, because that like there you want them as close to the users as possible, right? Like it's just kind of physics, right? Like unless you can get them there, everything will be slower for the end user, right? Like, and I think that's been one of our original selling points, right? Like that if you decouple these two things, it actually doesn't matter for us if you're on-prem or cloud for your existing like backend APIs and services and so on, right? Like what really matters for us is that we can help the actual experience to get really close to the user and run really fast, and then invest in things like private connectivity to those areas. So there's an element there where it might not be as much in need of something new coming. I think where we see a difference is probably more in like whenever we are in a deal cycle and we hear DevOps, it's typically either a danger to the deal or very positive. And it sort of falls into very different groups, right? Like there will be one type of DevOps that sees the tool like Netlify sort of as a threat, right? Like we want, like it's our job to manage every piece of infrastructure, right? Like if we're not doing that, then what are we doing, right? Like, and then there's another kind of DevOps that sees bringing in tools like Netlify as their job, right? Like that are like, my job is to make the developers I support ship faster with less cost, better results and so on, right? Like if I can like bring in a tool that streamlines that whole workflow, I'm kind of like really doing my job, and those typically are always in high demand and have no worries about what else to do if they automate that part, right? Like so that's typically where I see that kind of like maybe old guard and more modern thinking split.
Well, and I think this is the age-old debate for digital transformation, right? The idea that DevOps is in control of what the digital transformation is going to look like, and it can go in at speed or it can lag. And I think a lot of people are trying to understand, where they are in that spectrum of digital transformation. So I'm curious, what you see folks looking to build now. I mean, are they looking for more speed, more efficiency, more use of data, more apps distributed to down to the worker, or are you looking or are people looking more for, I don't know, more just kind of improved user interface? Where's the driver right now?
So I think one driver is just that, like for a long time now, and only with some acceleration from the pandemic and so on, right? Like the actual like digital touch point with your customers is more and more becoming what defines you as a brand, right? Like and who you are, right? Like, and that just, the more that happens and the more that spreads to almost every business, the more pressure it puts on your ability to really build compelling online experiences versus like buying something that's table stakes out of a box and putting it in front of people, right? Like, because suddenly like then that's what any consumer coming to your website perceives, right? Like this is like something pretty table stakes, right? Like, and typically that's not what you want. I think there's also been a continuous growing awareness of how important web performance is. The market in general always goes a bit back and forth, but has obviously become more and more global in general, right? Like, which also means that performance can't just be it's really fast in New York, but like it typically have to be fast wherever people visit you from. So I think figuring out that balance of like, how do you drive up the experience through fast iteration cycles? Because everybody knows that you can't really build compelling experiences with very slow iteration cycles, right? Like great fast cycles allow you to pull in user feedback and figure out what works. So how do you drive short iteration cycles while having flexibility to actually do custom development, right? Like, because again, you can buy tools that are sort of an out-of-the-box template builder or something. You'll get very fast iteration cycles, but very little flexibility to actually build something compelling, right? Like, or you can set up the full vertical stack and have your DevOps team do everything across it, and like you get a lot of flexibility but very slow iteration cycles. Our driver is sort of like, we can give you very high flexibility. You can build any kind of experience with this decoupled approach, but we can give you very high iteration cycles. Like on average, our enterprise segment of customers ships changes to production more than 25 times a day.
Is that right?
Yeah.
25 times a day?
Yeah.
Wow.
That's the kind of like, and I've been in meetings.
Those people need to put that. They need to put the
right?
keyboard
Like
down. That's
I know. Like I remember one sales conversation, like where we were down at lunch and there was a little stock. We had like one front end developer that really knew the tool, right? Like, and then a lot of people from R&D and security and DevOps and release managing engineer. And at lunch, it just like, I brought up my phone and I went in and I checked just our main app.netlify.com, right? Like our sort of main dashboard. And it just looked and said like, okay, today by lunchtime, my team has shipped to production about 17 times. How would you say you compare? Right? Like, and that was the point that they were like, if we could get to one a day, that would be a game changer, right? Like,
that's getting the iteration cycle pretty tight.
It is, but like our message is that like we help this client get to that point, right? Like there's a set of things you have to do to get there, but we actually know what those things are, right? Like, in our platform are really built around them, so we can really like actually unlock that level of velocity for teams, and it is a big game changer.
Well, and it has to be comforting for the DevOps people to be able to push something and know that if they didn't quite get it right, the feedback loop is very short, and they're not going to be just, collecting an avalanche of
totally right,
of change fix.
The shorter the feedback loop, the faster that cycle goes, right? Like, because the more confidence you have that if you release a bug, you can rein it in, the faster you will ship. And part of it is also our instant rollbacks, right? Like, so we guarantee that you can roll back to any known state of the UI.
The undo button.
Through a button, right? Like, you simply just go in globally within like 200 milliseconds, it will be atomically reverted all over the world.
I like that. I wish my life had a rollback feature. So let's talk about what holds people back. So obviously, it sounds like you're working with folks that are somewhat aggressive in terms of wanting to build new things and iterate quickly and push digital transformation in every way they can. But I also get a sense that right now, in the moment that we're at, with a lot of this impending technological revolution, that some people are hesitant to lean into anything right now at scale, because they don't know whether or not what's going to come is going to, be another game changer on top of the game changers that they're seeing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I would argue that when I look at like what's going to happen in the next 5 years or so, right? I think there's sort of three major trends for our space I'm really looking at that I think will have huge impact, right? Like, and the first of them is, it's no surprise, right? Like, it's AI, right? Like, everybody can see that we are at a point where there can be a lot of doubt of what AI is going to do, but it's going to have huge impacts, right? And I think the first time that there's a lot of things that are very hard to predict when it comes to AI and the web. And then there's some things that are very easy to predict. For example, I doubt anybody would argue that AI will make code and content production slower, right? Like, it will no doubt be like an acceleration on the amount of code we can write, on the amount of content we can produce, and the amount of assets we can produce, right? Like, which to me means that you have to be ready to increase this amount of throughput you can have through your system, right? Like, if once a week release window is a bottleneck for you now, then imagine that there's like exponential growth in the amount of code, the amount of content, the amount of assets you can produce. And it's easy to imagine that you'll be completely behind companies that have a high throughput, right? Like, so that's kind of like my first thesis, is just like throughput becomes even more important because everything is going to accelerate, right? Like, the second big like trend I think we'll see, that we're only in the very, very beginnings of, and that hasn't really started really playing out yet, is what I call UI 2.0, where I think since the dawn of computers, the human-computer interface was based on a computer being a deterministic machine that needed precise instructions, right? Like, you would type a command, the machine would do something deterministic. You would click a button, the machine would do something deterministic. You follow a link, it would go somewhere pre-planned, right? Like, one of the big things that's kind of happening with AI is that underlying constraint is seeping away, right? Like, suddenly you can have a computer act on your intent and go off and do pretty unpredictable things, right? And I think right now we have sort of very simple, like, we're still using the same UI paradigms around that, right? Like, we have the chat experiences. I think to some degree, chat experiences will start pulling people away from the web and into like big walled gardens like ChatGPT or Messenger or whatever X is going to turn into and so on, right? Like, but I also think that we will start discovering ways to build user interfaces and user experiences driven by these powers that have nothing to do with chat, right? Like, and that has to do with a computer that can interact with you in a very different way than they could before, right? Like, and again, I think over the next 5 years, I would expect that to lead to like just constant change in what customers would expect from landing on your website in many ways, right? Like, and again, I think that leads to sort of the third big trend that we are seeing to deal with exactly the concerns you brought up, which is this idea of composable architectures, right? Like, again, if it's already a bit limiting for you as a company to buy some experience out of the box in a monolith, imagine like when these change cycles really start picking up and you're expected to constantly react to them and build new things, right? Like, I think companies really need to prepare now to have the flexibility to be able to keep up with that and to keep up with that in a world of like much faster throughput across the board.
Do you mind if I take the middle one, the UI 2.0 first? Because this one's fascinating to me.
Yeah.
Because I think what you're saying, and it's my sense that the foundations of what we consider to be the web are going to change, and how we
Yeah.
the internet will exist, but the way we think about web architecture and where things are happening, particularly browser-based, is going to change completely.
It could. I think it'll be a mixture. First of all, like as someone who studied like cultural studies and so on, right? Like, whenever new media comes around, it never replaces the old one, to be fair, right? Like, we still have billboards on signposts, right? Like, we still have paper books, we still have cable TV, we still have talk radio, right? Like,
we don't have CDs, DVD.
It'll put under pressure, right? Like, but just like to start setting the ground, right? Like, I sometimes feel people overestimate the degree to which everything gets replaced. It's more like some whole new layer gets added on top of what we always have every time, right? Like, most of the time. But then in terms of that, as I said, like, I think every time there's a big platform change, and to some degree, AI will be a big platform change. There's a full set of things we can't predict, and then there's a full set of things that's the same as every other platform change before it, right? Like, one of the things that's happened in every single platform change after the web came around is that the web comes under pressure, right? Like, when mobile came around, a lot of like there was headlines on Wired about the web is dead and so on, right? Like everything was going to be mobile applications. When social media came around, there's a lot of talk about like the dark web and like the actual web would go away and there was real pressure, right? Like when I was raising the seed round for Netlify in sort of the start of 2016, it kept being one of the questions, like, why are you building something for the web? Isn't it kind of like the past, right? Like, and it was one of the motivations for building the company, that I think there's something incredibly powerful to the open web, right? Like this idea that anyone can register a domain and they own that, right? Like you're not renting on someone's platform, right? Like you actually just own something and there's no single company that like builds the web platform. It's just like some agreed upon set of standards that are pretty messy and evolving, but they're there, right? Like, so I think again with AI, we'll start seeing a similar like pressure on the web, right? Like there'll be a lot of interest in getting people out of the browser and into proprietary systems that someone owns and can monetize, right? Like, but there'll also be a response from all of us that are passionate about the web on like, what are the things that you can do in this instant media where like anyone can put up a URL and in seconds it's available to everyone in the world. There'll also be like, we're seeing, for example, at Netlify, this whole new category of AI developers, right? Like Devin from Cognition Lab, or GPT engineer from Lovable, or Bolt.new from StackBlitz, or even like the Grimoire GPT within the Chat GPT landscape that you can ask to build stuff for you, right? Like build me an application. And it's interesting to see that all of those centers around the web, right? Like, because you don't want them to build an application that you can't share with someone, or that you have to like submit for app review, right? Like, so in all of these cases, when you say like build an application and deploy it somewhere, they deploy them as a URL on Netlify, right? Like, because that's still one of the strengths of the web, right? Like that you can just, anyone can put something on a URL and everyone can link to it. So I think on the one hand, at the low end, we'll start seeing all of these ephemeral sites and apps and so on, right? Like we'll see an explosion in the production of web properties, just because we start democratizing what people can do. And then on the other end of the spectrum, I think we'll start seeing more and more web experiences that are at a different level than what you could build today without AI in many different ways. And that's like the hardest to predict, right? Like, because people are going to go invent crazy stuff, right? Like, but there's so much, I believe, that you can do on the web if you have the power of both all the generative abilities of AI and the interaction paradigms that you can unlock when a computer can understand your intent and personalize things for you and do all of these, like suddenly have all of these new capabilities.
Yeah, my other theory that I share liberally is the notion that the icons of this revolution are still in high school and we don't even know their names yet. The Jobs and the Gates and the Bezos and the Musks, they aren't even old enough to vote. But to your point, they're going to invent things that are going to transform their time, and they will become iconic. They'll build iconic companies around things that we haven't even began to understand, and they will disrupt potentially some of the most iconic companies that exist today, like Google or Facebook, and it's that's what's so cool, and it's got to be kind of exciting to be able to I don't know, to enable those folks with kind of access to a collection of tools, and see that kind of molecularly starting to happen. I mean, are you aware of kind of things happening that you think, okay, that might have something
I'm sort of tracking a lot of the things that happens in my space of like, what are the underlying primitives that you can start building on, almost more than the specific things people are doing right now, right? Like,
So what gets you excited about that? I mean,
so
which
some of the areas that keeps me excited is like, one area is just when I think about like the quality of the visual and interactive experiences we build in day on the web. They're still very constrained by us as people having to build something in a very generic format that has to work on both a desktop and a laptop and an iPad and an iPhone. We've built sort of a lot of design systems around that makes it possible, right? Like, but you go look at like a print version of Wired magazine from the 90s and a front page there and the layout within that magazine, right? Like, and then you go look at Wired.com's website and they will build a cool system there, right? Like, but there's sort of no comparison in the level of detail you can get to, right? Like, what if we can actually bring that level of detail forward by, instead of building just like a grid system and have humans plop in different content, work with building a generative AI for our property that knows how to like take the content we have right now and the device size that someone is viewing it and create that custom layout for us, right? Like, with all the tools that the modern web has available, with like WebGL animations and stuff like that, right? Like, that'll take a lot of research and things to come out of, right? Like, but that's one of the things that, like, as a starting point, right? Like, why, like, if you did that investment as a real brand, right? Like, you could actually start like building.
well, it feels like that's exactly what AI should be doing. Is and this is where I very bullish on it, but I'm also a little fearful for the human in this process because it can it can develop and test and iterate in cycles so quickly and model that iteration and feedback loop to a point where it will relentlessly come up with the singular best outcome over time faster than because of its ability to test and iterate off the feedback that it receives from testing. It's almost it's effectively superhuman in that it goes away from being the art of development to being just pure science.
So I'm not so worried about that, because when I see what AI is really good at, right? Like, they are still just really large probabilistic models that are good at predicting more of the same output they've seen before, right? Like, so I don't really see them having any sort of really interesting like creative abilities on their own to like innovate and come up with new stuff. Like, in that way, they're really subhuman, right? Like, they're superhuman in the capacity of doing like the work of very average human, completely automatic, right? Like, but I think that will just, like, in that way, I'm always like a technology optimist and more just curious, right? Like I'm more just imagine that, like, imagine everyone get access to all of that building power, right? Like, what can humans then come up with, right? Like, what is it we can push that, like, we are very good at coming up with crazy shit.
Aren't we large language models? Aren't we just neural
No.
networks? Aren't we just? I mean, if you think about the creative process in movie making or I mean, in kind of the classic creative, the a rock and roll musician is channeling what they heard when they were learning music, and as a kid, they're not channeling anything. They're just iterating off of previous um, large language inputs. And
I think it's more of a mixture of that. I think obviously large language models are derived from some of the pieces that also make humans work, right? Like, um, but they are also, when you go in and like actually build them and train them and so on, right? Like they are also very different, right? Like they are fundamentally like trained on very, very large data sets to probabilistically predict more stuff like that data set, right? Like, and they are not like, we're not like that, right? Like we don't get put in a box for like 3 months and then we come out with a new model of me that has like a certain set of skills to know, right? Like I'm constantly
Aren't
absorbing,
we?
learning, and
I keep
generating
coming back to
ideas
that. It
like that.
feels like school to me. I mean, it isn't this
Because
isn't this
every day we learn. Like these models doesn't actually learn, right? Like they don't ingest anything back into themselves from the outside. You can artificially build like rack storage that you can inject into the
so?
prompt with
I see
new
what you're
memory,
saying.
but they're not like evolving biological systems that learn as they go along, right? Like they are big
Visually absorbing
probabilistic and
new
and
ideas.
even
Yeah.
deceptive in that you can have a conversation with it and so on, right? Like, but they're very different, right? Like, um, and who knows? Maybe someday we get to a level of artificial general intelligence, but it's not going to happen just by scaling large language networks. It will require like several like whole new breakthroughs, I believe.
I can't. I tell you what. I've seen them all. I'm old enough to remember the PC revolution and obviously the internet and the
Yeah.
web and mobile and cloud and I've never seen anything like this. This one is going to be bigger than all of those and I, you know, the and I remember, the early days of the internet where people said, I'm never going to use a credit card. I'm never going to
Yeah, yeah, you do.
read an email that is a commercial email. I'll never, all the spam I receive. It's like,
I know,
it's,
I know. But
um,
I think it's also because like they do touch on a different level of something that used to feel very human exclusive, right? Like this ability to, as I say, like this break in the fundamental paradigm of how we expect to interact with the computer, right? Like which was always fully deterministic in a way, right? Like I mean, sure, it could have some random number generator or something, right? Like, but it was not able to like, you couldn't just tell it to go do something and it would try to actually go do it, right? Like, and that is a really, really big change, right? Like, but I would still caution on letting that over index in thinking that these models are more human than they are still really just like big algorithms. Um, as I said, this could change, but it would still, in my mind, take some real fundamental discoveries to make that change, right? Like, and until then, what we have is a whole new type of tool that will have like mass impact on almost everything. But I still think it's fundamentally a tool that will be driven by humans figuring out what to do with it and how to drive it.
well, let's talk about that because you're right. I mean, all of this possibility has been built by humans. I mean, we're creating this opportunity in a very human way. Let's talk about your human journey while we have a little more time. So you made decisions along the way, as we all do. And you probably remember a few of them as perhaps more fortuitous than others, but talk a little bit about where you specifically remember thinking, I'm going to go this direction rather than this direction, and that kind of opened up your journey and really led you to where you are today. Do you remember any of those singular waypoints?
Of course, there's been many of them, right? Like, and in many different directions, because sure haven't taken a very straight path to where I am today. Like, probably one of the earliest one was when I first fell in love with computers in a way, right? Like, and dating myself, this was also well before the internet and so on, right? Like, I think the very first I got to see was like a Pong machine or something, right? Like, and it was
Yeah,
just
I agree.
pretty
Same.
magical that like you could turn those little knobs and the screen did something, right? Like in some way there was some kind of like place in there that was like interactive and you could do things with, and then started begging my parents for a computer until I convinced them to give me a Commodore 64 in the early years, right? Like, and just again, just that magic that you could type some stuff and then you would have this like program that you could interact with, right? Like from the first little, from like the instruction manual, building a little guessing game, right? Like just the fact that like, hey, I built something that someone else could interact with and would interact back just immediately seemed magical in a way, right? And then of course, like next, the first time I visited a friend that had a modem, right? Like, and we realized, like, I don't know, back then it was like even pre-web, right? Like, so it was like we would find a list of BBSs that you could call up on your modem and like see what was happening there, right? Like, and suddenly you're chatting from Denmark with someone in the US, right? Like, and it's like, wow, it's like someone is on the other side, and like it happens inside this virtual world, right? Like reading those old William Gibson cyberpunk books, a similar way of like triggering that like curiosity. Meanwhile, I never saw it as like, it was fairly enough. Like I grew up in a family where my mom was a conservatory teacher and a professional pianist. My dad was a radio producer and presenter. Everybody was worried about me spending all this time just in front of a computer. Like, what's going to become of him, right? And I picked up on my own. I found the piano and like went and studied, took a bachelor in musicology and literature, and then started a major in cultural studies while working as a freelance musical journalist. All the time programming as a hobby and a passion, and something I just felt was like I still had just that initial bug from the first time I experienced the computer. And then I met a girl from Spain and like went and visited her. She came and visited me, and I went there a bit, and I thought like, okay, I'm going to go to Madrid, stay there for like 3 months and finish up my master's thesis. Went there and pretty quickly realized, okay, I'm going to stay for more than 3 months. And also the market for writing about music in Danish in Madrid was not great. It was like, okay, I probably need a plan B. And I'd always just been building stuff, right? Like, so I started building some different web stuff for like a Sudoku challenge online, this browser-based procedurally generated space game and so on. And before I really finished that, someone discovered it and hired me as one of the early engineers on a Denver-based social media startup. And then worked there and learned a bunch there, and then ran into some people at a Ruby on Rails conference, and they hired me for a startup in Madrid. And somehow over a couple of years, I went from being an engineer to tech lead to director of technology and then CTO of the company. And then I started a startup, as I mentioned in the beginning, in Spain. Came to the Bay Area, working with that, and then saw sort of this broad opportunity in like, what if there's a real profound architecture shift about to happen on the web? How can I accelerate that? How can I be part of making the web like the best platform? And that led me to starting Netlify.
So what do you think separated you to become entrepreneurial? I mean, there are a lot of people who find the path that you found and are perfectly content to just work their way right up to the CTO level and be perfectly content in a large company or wherever. What triggered you to say, no, I want to go build something that I build? And secondarily, what is it about you, or what would you say people should think about in terms of understanding themselves that allows you to do it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's hard to come up with a single answer, right? Like I always, like, even when I look at it's funny to see, right? Like when I look at the old group of people I would hang out with in high school, right? Like we were always sort of an odd bunch, never part of like the popular kids or anything, and like doing weird things. And we're definitely not like looking like we were in any specific path to any specific career and so on, right? Like, but when I look back, like one of them ended up becoming my co-founder at Netlify many years after we had been apart from a long time, and both of us had started companies independently. And like another became like serial entrepreneur. Another like there was just like this whole stretch to like, who is it I even found it interesting just instinctively to be around. And there was kind of always people that had some kind of builder in them, right? Like, and people that didn't really see life as like a straight path of like, I have to go get my job and my wife and my kid and my car and my like, but that were more driven by curiosity and impact, right? Like, and I think that's probably what's been key to me, right? Like, I've always been sort of more driven by what 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 can I do that have some really interesting impact, and what can we come up with?
I think it's interesting that you found folks in your youth that all effectively became entrepreneurial, and yet you didn't realize at the time that you were becoming friends that maybe there was some I don't know, there's some collective skill set or traits that brought you together that would lead you to want to start companies independently.
Yeah. I mean, it is funny, right? Like, and everybody just had a little off the cuff, like just doing stuff, right? Like, like we had this weird experience. It's like my co-founder and I, right? Like, again, we didn't know we would start. Like, when we knew each other, we were mainly playing computer games and going to a lot of jazz concerts, right? And then I went to Madrid and I started this whole journey. At that time, he was studying film and media, and I was studying cultural studies, right? Like, he built a production company in the space of like Flash microsites with like mixing interactive video with Flash, and sold it right at the right point before Flash stopped being a thing and became a chief digital officer and partner in an agency when I reached out and was sort of like, hey, let's do something together, right? And we went a while after we had started Netlify to this like dinner with Index Ventures in San Francisco for Nordic founders, and hadn't thought about any like that we recognized anyone, and it was like this like controlled discussion around the table on specific topic and so on. And then when we were done, the guy sitting right in front of me like suddenly asks, hey, do you by any chance know this guy called Jimmy? And Jimmy was like one of our old friends back from high school. That was like an interesting character. Like, he ended up moving to Thailand and then Cambodia, and like who knows what he's doing now. But he was like a very unlikely tie-in to anyone you would sit with as at an Index Venture dinner. And both me and Chris started laughing, and it turned out the guy in front of me was this guy Ingvar that we'd always just like been at LAN parties together at Jimmy's house or at my house and so on, right? Like, I hadn't recognized him as first. And it turns out that his brother is the VC from Index Ventures that invited us. And it turns out his other brother is the founder of Unity, right? Like, and it's like, who would have thought? So I don't really know what it was, but there was definitely something that brought all of us sort of like oddballs together back then, way before any of us were doing any obvious things that would lead us on this path.
Well, so what makes you good at it? And what would you say for somebody considering becoming an entrepreneur, they should maybe take an inventory of? I mean, what is it? What are kind of some of the DNA elements of a good entrepreneur?
I don't think there's one set, because there's so many. Like, the whole thing I would say is that when you take a path as just going and building a company, there isn't really any blueprint in the same way as when you follow some career ladder, right? Like, there you're sort of judged by a system that will say like this is how you perform here, right? Like, when you go start something, it's kind of up to you to come up with those parameters, right? Like, so the first quality is to be okay with that, right? Like, you got to be really okay with a lot of uncertainty. You got to be very, very stubborn, I think. Like, you just have to have something like innately, deeply stubborn in you, because like, no matter what you do, if what you're doing is actually a good idea, it's also going to be a weird idea in the beginning to anybody else, right? Like, you're rarely going to get success with something that seems completely obvious from the beginning, because then everybody would be doing it, right? Like, so in the early stages, you got to be like, the whole way through have this stubbornness of thinking like, okay, everybody else might think this is stupid, but I think it's like real. And it's also really hard, right? Like, it's not like every sort of sudden emergent story is something always have a lot of grind behind it, right? Like, and even when you start building and get bigger. Like that grind never ends, right? Like, so you have to have a lot of just pure grit and persistence, and just like, again, I think it's just, to me, it comes down to essentially being very, very stubborn in some ways, right? Like, um, and then on top of that, it's just very different what people are good at, right? Like some people are amazing go-to-market people, right? Like, and it's just amazing at coming up with a creative way of selling something that might not be like unique. Some people are inventors and are good at coming up with something that other people wouldn't have come up with. Some are really good at seeing like trends and understanding where the landscape is going and what could be interesting to build if the landscape is going there, right? Like that can really vary, but I think there's core characteristics of being willing to be a contrarian, to be very stubborn and very persistent. Those are kind of like a foundation that without those, you gotta give up along the way.
Well, and you also have to be somewhat charismatic, because in the end, you can't just be an entrepreneur by yourself. You have to start to assemble a team, and people have to believe you. I mean, there has to be. I mean, you can believe in something, but if you can't convince anybody else, it's going to be a very lonely entrepreneurial journey. And in the end, I think the only way you can become notable, like yourself, is to find co-founders, but also find that next layer, that team to build. What do you look for in folks when you're starting to build a team?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Like, because of course it always changes along the journey, right? Like it all depends, right? Like some founders come with just like an amazing network they've already built in the Bay Area, and they just tap those people and they've worked with them before, right? Like I didn't have that advantage. I came from like Denmark and Spain and started something here and didn't have much of a network, so I couldn't go for just pulling in my network. I had to try to find people, right? Like, and I always found that you got to find that early stage, you got to find people that for whatever reason are strange enough that instead of going to work for some big company with a really safe salary and like a very clear like outcome of what they're getting and so on, for some reason don't want that. They want to sort of challenge themselves to something challenging and odd and weird and see if they can have real impact, right? Like, so the first, when you're starting in these early stages, you got to find that, right? Like, and you got to look for people early on that have potential ahead of them rather than a ton of experience behind them, right? Like, because again, if someone has been forever in big companies, they're probably just going to be very used to that kind of lifestyle and salary, and they're going to want to go on, right? Like, so typically you're looking for people that have like some patterns of having jumped a bit and done different things and trying to figure out a path that's really interesting for them, and that are not totally comfortable with like the big company model, and that also, to be fair, might not like last with you if you become a big company, because then they'll start feeling that that's a pain again, right? Like, but you want to find those early ones that are really focused on like thinking that a real challenge is they're not afraid of it. They think it, they're drawn to it, and that want to really like be builders and create something, and that has talent ahead of them, right?
Well, and I think you're spot on there. There is this kind of dichotomy of what people get out of work. I think certainly some people, at a baseline, want comfort, safety, a salary that allows them, and to provide for their family and themselves, and live a good life. But that you can get that in a lot of ways without the secondary element of building something. And sometimes you'll even forego some of that comfort in order to get that satisfaction of of creating something bigger than yourself, bigger than even what you thought. It's a very rewarding experience, over and above anything that dollars can provide.
And there's always, there's this old, I mean, I think it's probably a myth, but it's good enough that everybody chooses to believe it in on the older ad that Ernst Shackleton ran in the newspaper to try to recruit people for his polar expedition, right? Like that supposedly just says, men wanted for hazardous journey, low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in event of success. That's that.
Right. And those are the people you want, the ones that respond to
People
that.
you want really early on, right? Like,
Yeah, no, and you probably deliver some sort of similar message in the initial interview process and when you're having conversations with folks where you're honest with them about where you are. I mean, it you can't sit there and sugarcoat it. It's like you're coming in, you're going to have to wear many hats, you're going to have to work long hours, you're going to have to do things that are not necessarily everything you want to do, but that will help us get bigger.
and you'll grow a lot, right? Like, these are people that like this idea of really challenging themselves and growing through it, right? Like, and it's not for everyone, right? Like, so you want to find the people that actually think for your reason, like that's really enjoyable. Right?
Yeah, no, this has been a great conversation, and I'd love to continue it. I know we only have a limited time, and I think we could keep going on and on because you've seen a thing or two. I always love to talk to folks who have built and are still excited about building and can see all the possibilities that are in front of us. It's an amazing time, as it always seems to be in enterprise technology.
Yeah. I mean, that's always, like, in reality, there's never any completely, like, there's always opportunity, right? Like, there's always a lot going on. But there's no doubt that, like, the whole fundamental change we're about to see through AI will create a lot of opportunity for people that are excited about discovering new things and building into change. And it's going to be very, like, scary to people who are afraid of change, right? Like, because, like, that's the one thing that's pretty easy to predict, that a lot of things in the next 5 years are going to change fast.
Well, Matt Biilmann, CEO of Netlify, thank you very much for being on the Inside Jam podcast. We very much appreciate it, and best of luck in everything that you're working on.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Solutions Review is inviting you to join InsightJam.com. What started a few years ago as a social media event to celebrate enterprise technology has now grown into an always-on tech community with live events, discussions, videos, vendor showcases, and industry resources. Our vetted roster of experts, thought leaders, and analysts are sharing tips and tricks daily. So if you're interested in getting involved, join the long list of companies and brands who have already participated by visiting InsightJam.com today.